All right, welcome back everyone to another legislative interview series. I'm your host, Kevin Scorsone. Joining me today is Stephen Peterson, the Associate Clinical Professor of Economics at the University of Idaho. Stephen, thanks so much for doing this. And I think it's an important place to start for you to tell our audience a little bit about you, a little bit about your background, and then we can talk about how this housing study came about.
Okay, I'm a regional economist at the University of Idaho, clear across the other side of the country. My specialty is doing the local economic impact studies, and I've done, I don't know, something like 300 studies over the course of my career, many of them nationwide as well. And basically every major industry in our region, Pacific Northwest, and then several nationwide as well. We were approached a couple of years ago to do a housing study up in Coeur d'Alene, which is a resort community about an hour north of where we are. And we were very intrigued by it. Of course, there's been exploding housing prices, every place and everywhere. They have some unique challenges being a resort community, as well as all of the other factors that have been affecting housing prices. And so that's how we got into the study of housing, and it's been absolutely fascinating on one hand and somewhat terrifying on the other when you realize the implications of all of the effects of the spike in housing prices and the shortage of housing.
Yeah, it's a pretty unique time, certainly, to be delving into the world of housing and understanding all of that. And when we spoke earlier this year, I was just sort of fascinated with everything that you're doing. So I appreciate you being on today and talking a little bit about it. One of the first things I wanted to talk about is here in Raleigh and in the surrounding areas, there's limited availability with housing. Inventory certainly becoming an issue. And with the housing that's available, the prices and affordability obviously become an issue. Based on your study, have you found this to be the same in other areas in the country? And I was curious as to if you've noticed any trends with that, or what has been the biggest takeaway focusing in on those two.
A couple of things. The thing I've noticed nationwide, this problem is every place and everywhere. And with some exceptions, I found the median price of a home in some rural areas around $30,000.
Okay, there you go.
And I'm going to make a point to visit those communities just to see what a $30,000 median home price, and then all the way up to nearly $1.4 million throughout the country. What common characteristics are is almost every place and everywhere within the last 7 to 10 years, prices have doubled. And the only real difference is where the base started, and where I see the critical zone is in those areas that already had a very, very high base. So these are communities where it started at 500,000 and now they're at $1 million, right? And you see many of the West Coast cities that we've looked at are in that phenomena. So the problems every place and everywhere. And then a couple things on the causes. I have these in two buckets. One is things we can do, areas that we can help alleviate the problem, and then those are outside of our control, right?
Yeah.
And I'll start with those outside of the control. The biggest cause of this whole crisis went back 15 years ago with the Great Recession from 2007, 2009. What I don't think a lot of people realized is it cratered the housing market in the United States, and the construction industry in particular. So by the time we got a decade out of that, we were by some estimates 10 million units down to where we were supposed to be. So when that happened, both demand and supply collapsed. And then suddenly demand woke up in 2016 and there was no supply. Mm-hmm. And then you factor in, all of a sudden you've got COVID, right? And all of the COVID, the stimulus packages were, I think I've seen numbers as high as $6 trillion. And a central bank keeping the interest rates as, around 2.5%. I sold real estate decades ago, and the average interest rate was somewhere around 8%. So, long time ago. So 2.5% or 3% for mortgage rates were incredibly, inexpensive. And so it then the supply chain issues and the labor market constraints, all of those, all of those were the I think the proximate cause of this. And then in Coeur d'Alene, they have a lot of special characteristics, but also as everywhere is the labor force is realigning, right? So there's a lot of telecommuting now. And so a lot of people were fleeing Seattle and Portland in this case, which are very high cost areas. And they were moving, 6 hours away to Coeur d'Alene. And you could be at a resort community and be working from your home, right? Well, from the locals' perspective, that wasn't a good idea, right? Because they're taking up housing that should be going to, people at people that are local, right? So from their perspective, they weren't all that enamored by that whole movement. So you have all of that is I think is approximate causes, and then more of a long-term causes is a lot of zoning and zoning regulations and a lot of lack of understanding, I think, among a lot of the local populations that, if we want to look at the kinds of things we can do to fix it, the blame points all back to us. And I was at a housing presentation in Coeur d'Alene on this study, and I asked this. These were all professionals, right? Governmental, private builders, realtors. I asked them, what if somebody brought a proposal to you to build a fourplex or a townhouse series or a duplex? Would you be for it or against it? And I said, if you're for it, you're part of the solution. If you're against it, you're part of the problem. So I think a lot of it comes down to those issues there.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up there at the end, because we have been a vocal supporter. We just went to the Raleigh City Council. Well, not just, this was probably back in April already. The summer's flying by already. But we went to the Raleigh City Council meeting in support of middle housing, those duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes that you mentioned. And those need to be considered in order to solve this problem.
Yeah.
We're totally on board with that. And I think too, you made a good point that the interest rates that have been getting some of the blame really aren't the problem. The interest rates are still low, comparatively speaking, to what
they are. They are. I'm old school enough that I predated the internet age. I hate to admit that, actually, but I did. So they had these basically mortgage books they would produce, right? So you could match up what the payment would be for a house, given house price, and what interest rate it was. The lowest interest rate was 10%.
Yeah. Perfect example.
You got to think about that for a minute, and it goes up from there. Yeah.
There's, in my case, as a government affairs director, I look to solutions through legislation, through our elected officials helping with this cause. That's my responsibility. But I wanted to open that up to you. You mentioned those two buckets. What do you see as solutions to the problem? I mean, I think you touched on a huge one with the middle housing and the expansion of those duplexes and triplexes. But is there anything that you can pinpoint the changes that you'd like to see sooner rather than later?
I think fundamentally a change in attitudes. What I've witnessed over the years was anytime any builder or realtor would come in with a proposal to build a facility, there'd be almost instantaneous opposition to it, no matter what the case was, right? In fact, here locally, I can't remember a subdivision that came in that somebody didn't protest it somewhere, right? And so if you give that kind of veto power to anybody, you'll not have any construction at all. So I think that we need to move forward to realize that it is essential to our community's well-being to promote housing. And for me, anything that brings in additional housing, typically, with some exceptions, but any of these proposals, like land trust, there's all kinds of experimental programs out there, and for all of them, right? As long as the number of units go up. But I think we need a change in attitudes on how we approach housing, that we want to welcome our neighbors, right? And we want to realize we're all in the same community together. And let me give you an example. Up in Coeur d'Alene, In 2016, you got to think about just how recent that is. We did an estimation that 3/4 of the households could afford a median price home in 2016. By the time you got to 2022, only 1/4 of the population could.
Wow.
So there is no way the children of the residents up there could afford to stay in the community, because they're looking at $600,000 and up to be able to get into the housing market. So you're changing fundamentally changing the character of your community, and not in a good way from my perspective.
Yeah, that's great insight, that those numbers sort of shocking to just think about 2016 and now where we are, and that big of a shift. I wanted to touch briefly or a little bit on the economic impact and assessing how local communities like the ones you mentioned and businesses are impacted by the housing costs and limited inventory. It seems right now that because costs are higher, housing costs are higher. If you are getting into a home, you're probably not having that much money to go out and give back to the community, support local businesses. What's your take on that with the economic side?
Well, we went up and looked at up in Coeur d'Alene, we looked at the job shortages, right? And then we parsed out the portion that we thought was natural turnover versus what we thought was being caused by housing. We kept our numbers conservative as possible. But when we got down, our estimation of the impacts of the housing crisis up there, it cost the community 3,000 jobs.
Wow.
And $500 million in output. So it's costing jobs. These housing shortages are, so in that sense alone, it is altering the livability of your communities, and they're having trouble. Nurses are having trouble finding affordable doctors. There's even rumors that physicians can't afford the housing. Right, things are pretty bad there. Down in near the Sun Valley area, they had a massive housing shortage down there in Idaho. Right, that's a resort area. And there was talk about putting up a tent city. These are for professionals, school teachers. Have them live in tents, right? That didn't go over so well. But that kind of shows you how serious the housing crisis is.
Well, you make a good point there. I talked to my wife about this. She's a nurse, been a nurse for a number of years now. Some of her colleagues or people that she knows are forced, if instead of, they have two options, basically rent where they are in where they work, I should say. But if they want to own, they have to go 45 minutes, an hour out into the major cities. And you're sort of taking that workforce in your community, your firefighters, police officers, nurses, I guess even doctors maybe,
Yeah.
And forcing them to commute 45 to an hour and sort of taking them out of the community. And I think that's been an overlooked issue, is that sort of these pillars of your community aren't really a part of your community. They're living somewhere else in order to afford working in your community.
Yeah.
So that's been interesting to me as I've gone through a lot of this. We touched on it briefly earlier, but it's fascinating to me. This is sort of the flip side to the coin. Are there areas in the country, I mean, even one or two spots that you can think of that have done a good job balancing the house cost, the inventory shortage, along with increasing their economic value to businesses? And
everything has trade-offs, right? And oftentimes these are in the eye of the beholder, right? For adequate housing can sometimes be derided as sprawl, right? And so I think so you got all these trade-offs. But if we did a comparison of the Houston MSA with the San Jose MSA, and we were looking at it, and Houston had this explosive population growth, explosion of its economy, right? And San Jose grew much more moderately. And when we did this, the typical price of a house in Houston, the median price was about $260,000. In the San Jose MSA, it was 1.3 million.
Wow.
And when you look at, there's a lot of different factors. We want to be cautious about that. There's a lot more land availability in Houston than there is in San Jose and all that. But it's local zoning, local restrictions that we estimated were the local attitudes towards expanding workforce housing were the key factors in that difference. And so there are areas of the country that have managed to keep, even with all of these factors, keep housing at least in the range to where a nurse or a school teacher or a manufacturing worker can find livable housing and buy a home.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's, I think, the risk certain booming areas run is, and I've talked about this with our area, is that if changes aren't made to have more housing, to have more affordable housing, eventually people and families will look to go work in places maybe like Houston if they
Exactly.
don't want
And
to.
it's a warning for a lot of these large metropolitan, states. It should be a warning to them that if they don't fix their housing problem, people are gonna vote with their feet and they're gonna leave.
Yeah.
It's simple as that. And that can be a loss. Some of these areas are some of the most highly productive, in terms of productivity per worker. They're some of the most highly productive areas of the country. So when you're forced out of that labor market to go elsewhere because you can't afford housing, it actually lowers the growth rate of GDP nationally.
Well, I think for a state like New York has seen a lot of that over the last
Yeah,
number of years, is that, you know, some areas in New York, like Rochester, have very have houses that are affordable. But if you look in other spots in upstate or specifically downstate, uh, housing affordability is tough, but the taxes on top of it are so tough. And people have chosen, like you said, to leave with their feet and get out and go to other states like North Carolina, like Florida, other places down the East Coast that have a little bit better options right now. But to your point, if you don't see progress, people will continue to find those areas like Houston and others. I have a couple more here, and then we'll let you go, and appreciate your time here today. When you're analyzing regional and local areas, what are some of the things you focus on to get the most comprehensive and complete data? Like, I'll just bring this up for examples. A new issue that's come up for us is we are for expansion within infrastructure, specifically mass transit, something we don't have. So I was just curious as to some of the areas you look at when looking into the housing data. Do you see certain areas because of their mass transit, because of the weather? What are some of the factors that you've seen so far?
I think infrastructure I think is a very important component to all of this. Out here in our area, it's interesting. You have to look at things as basic as adequate sewer and water systems, particularly in the smaller towns, is a big issue. Having basically transportation networks. We have issues with road quality out here, particularly north-south routes that tend to be very poor. So certainly road quality, things like bike lanes, and mass transit, I think are all very important considerations in this formula. And in terms of that, infilling a community is the easiest way to alleviate a lot of those issues. Yeah. Is to take existing neighborhoods and increase the density. If you do that, the additional transportation costs, the additional utility costs, all of that is much less than if you're commuting in from an hour's out, or you're putting in new subdivisions. So I think the low-hanging fruit is what strategies can a community use to increase the density within the community. And I think that particularly in our region, I think that's a really important issue.
The last thing I want to talk about, I think before I joined the Raleigh Realtor, before I joined RRAR, our association here, I was aware that housing prices were going up, but I sort of wasn't aware of the inventory of sort of the the depth that this can go. And I think that's true for a lot of people. What's your message to people that might not be looking at this issue clearly enough? I think we've talked about a lot of the impacts it could have, but is there something that, you know, stands out to you that says this isn't sustainable for a long period of time, and there's all these reasons why?
Yeah, it just isn't. If you look at the ability of your children to live in the community you were raised in, that goes out the window, unless they're going to live in your basement.
Yeah.
Till their 50s, right? Yeah. So in order to have a community that you can have your children, you know, stick around and participate in the community, have multi-generational families. I think that's a really important issue, to be able to keep the community, you know, in terms of its occupational mix diverse. I think is very important, right? To have you know, everything from white collar to blue collar workers be able to afford and live you know, in the same community. I think that ultimately, if you don't have an adequate housing stock, you'll start losing jobs, or you'll lose potential growth. You'll alter the structure of your workforce. And at the end of the day, the only people that can afford the housing in your community might not be the same type of mix that you grew up in, right? A radically different type of society, right, is built around the lack of affordable housing. And then a lot of the homelessness, if you raise housing prices dramatically like they have been, you're lowering people's real income. There's no way around it. So you could look at this proportionally as a reduction in people's real income by increasing their housing and living costs. And so it is important to preserve you know, the quality of life that you have to be able to fix the issue. And then there's a structural issue. A lot of people are trapped in the homes they have, and they can't move, right? Because of the interest rate differential now, and because of the lack of choice, you end up with couples that started out with no kids in a 2-bedroom. Now they have 4, right? And then you have a retired couple on the other hand that's got a 4-bedroom house and 3 of the bedrooms are empty. In a normal, healthy market, they would just switch places, right? Ultimately through the market process. Many times that's not happening, so it leads to a massive misallocation of housing. So you end up with that with these kinds of issues. And I saw a stat that just came out from the National Realtors that the number of existing homes for sale are down 20% from what they were last year at this time. So.
No, that's all phenomenal information and great insight that I know our members are going to be interested in hearing about. I think what you're doing and the work you're doing is fascinating, and I really appreciate you taking time out of your week to just talk to me a little bit and to provide our membership with a little bit of more insight to everything that's going on, not just in our area, but throughout the country. So I thank you very much for coming on today and having.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.